Hello and welcome to the Game Dev London podcast, a community of amazing people who love talking about and sharing their love of the details behind making games, whether or not they're actually based in London. I'm your host, Oscar Clark, he, him pronouns, and I am on a quest to understand everything you wanted to know about game dev, but never dared to ask. Today, I'm joined by Payne, and we're going to be talking about the joys of the interactive world, the thing that's become so topical and so exciting, well, depending on how skeptical you're feeling, which is all about the metaverse. Now, I have a history in that. We'll get into that in a bit, but let's introduce my guest, Chris Payne, who's going to talk to us about this space. Chris, you're a fellow Game Dev London host. Do you want to just to give people a little bit of an explanation of who you are and what you do?
Sure. Hi, Oscar. I have been working in video games for a couple of decades and currently running Quantum Soup Studios. I have not worked in massively multiplayer games very much, but I've done a lot of immersive stuff for like VR and flat screen. So I think we do have slightly different opinions on this topic, but let's find out.
And I should probably explain my background on this. So, again, a couple of decades plus of working in games. I happen to have been working online throughout all of that. So basically, I literally wrote the book on games as a service, and I think it's an intrinsically linked. And we'll get into this when we get into the definitions of what a metaverse is. So I even think the stuff we were doing on dial-up modems, where we had a shared website, we were talking about different games in the same space, where club captains for Doom and Counter-Strike and Age of Empires were getting together to play poker together in a virtual space to talk about how the service worked. That to me is as much part of the metaverse idea as running around a virtual world and using blockchain or whatever other technique you're using to own things might be. But we will get into all of those elements shortly. Probably the more important role I had in this space was I was home architect on PlayStation's virtual world, PlayStation Home, and I was absolutely delighted. I think it was this week, or was it the week before, when they announced that a bunch of kind of fans, amateurs, have basically gone back and they've recreated from the binaries the PlayStation Home experience. An amazing thing. I'm so excited, and definitely, it's just I cannot tell you how nice it is when you see that people's passion for a space still lasts however many years later. So let's get into it. So I think we kind of already stumbled on one of the biggest problems of the metaverse. What is it? Is it what Facebook are doing? I think this is the elephant in the room we can't avoid talking about. Is Horizon Worlds, is that the metaverse? Is that what the metaverse means? What do you think, Chris?
I think it's fair to, since they're using the word from William Gibson's cyberpunk classic Neuromancer, that we should use that fiction as our yardstick. So if they've co-opted the name from that book. So in that book, for anybody who hasn't read it, basically the metaverse
stop listening to us now. Go read it.
I mean, obviously that would be the best. The metaverse is basically the internet, but it is a virtual space that you jack into, like the Matrix, and then it's. Honestly, I'm not a huge fan of Ready Player One, but their vision of the virtual online world is pretty close to Gibson's metaverse. There's no die in the game, you die in real life nonsense in that. You can jack out whenever you like, but the real world is just miserable, and so a lot of people spend their time in the virtual world. And I think that is an interesting feature of both of those, both Ready Player One and Gibson's metaverse, is that it's a dystopia. People are in there because real life is so awful, and that is the thing that drives them into the virtual space. And
that's so dark.
Yeah. So why would you aspire to recreate that in real life?
Well, I mean, I kind of understand where you're coming from. Now, I mean, to my mind, the interesting thing about predictive fiction, in terms, or speculative fiction in that sense, that kind of Arthur C. Clarke, it's the fact that he recognized that we'd get a travelator does not necessarily mean that we're going to feel like the travelator is the only thing in the world that will exist. And we are delighted when we can move faster through airports because such things exist. We don't necessarily expect to be able to have multi-speed variants of it that will allow us to travel through cities, replacing cars, which is, I'm probably mixing up my stories there. It's been a while since I read the Clark stuff that talked about that. But my point here is more that I think that Gibson's idea was not about necessarily what the future would be, but about creating a space to explore ideas of connectivity, ideas of what computing is, a metaphor for sitting there in front of a screen and connecting in other worlds. Now, I don't even remember, I think it was written early enough that sitting in front of a screen wasn't necessarily what computing was even, but I'm not entirely sure of my timelines on when he wrote it. My point is more that the metaverse is not as much about what was written about. It's more about how it has become a vehicle to explain as shorthand ways of connecting with other people. And I think if we take it from that perspective, if the metaverse is what we want it to be, not necessarily what the kind of dystopian nightmare could be, then we need to understand what the qualities are. Where I stumble is problems we had even with PlayStation Home back in the day, which is, when it first started, there was nothing there. When we first started, we were getting really quite harsh critique from people like Penny Arcade, and to be fair, not undeserved, which were artifacts of the experience rather than the intent of the experience. And when you actually had by the time it ends, 2015, April the 1st, yes, genuinely April the 1st, April Fool's Day, they shut it off. The funniest thing ever was Alpha Zone 4, which is a fan news kind of website community, did an announcement that PlayStation Home comes out of beta, which I still think is the funniest joke ever, but then I'm slightly biased. But that night, people sat in a beach apartments or different apartments with their friends, chatting, waiting for it to get turned off. There's an emotional connection, a genuine emotional connection that happened there. So to say that there's not a value, to sort of say that there's not something there, I think is missing the point. I think what we've discovered through the pandemic is actually some really interesting things that happen when we become online native, digital native. One of the problems we have with the Zoom meeting is the fact that I have to talk to everybody on the Zoom meeting or in a breakout room. I can't walk up to you. I can't discover you. I can't interact in the world. And the environment doesn't affect the way we communicate. Whereas in a virtual world, it can.
Oh, that's very true. I've used a VR chat room and got into a conversation with a guy from Texas randomly.
Yeah.
And then I felt I couldn't walk away because it would be rude to just walk off. And he would be able to, and I couldn't even make an excuse that I had to log off now or something, because he'd be able to see if I was still there in the space.
Yeah.
So it was fascinating that my real world manners carried over completely into the virtual space. And yeah, it felt a little bit awkward, and it was exactly like getting stuck in a conversation with someone that you didn't really want to talk to at a conference.
But again, we're going down the dystopian path here.
Well, yeah, that's my role. I'm going to be the negative Nelly in this conversation.
Yeah, that's all good. But let's step back a bit. So, I mean, if we accept that there's something about kind of a teleportation that goes on by being in a virtual world. Now, again, I don't want to necessarily say that I think that virtual worlds are necessary for a metaverse. I think interoperability in some form. I think it's actually, for me, I mean, the phrase meta is misused by people a lot. for example, metaphysics is supposed to be looking above, looking separate from physics. But we kind of think of it, we kind of frame it as that phrase means that it's a stronger version of something. If we talk about, I often talk about you've got the kind of context loop of a game, but you've also got the also, my brain's just frozen. But anyway, you've got the kind of meta game of a game. What's a meta game? Well, most people talk about the thing that we keeps us playing in a meta game. Actually, it should be the things that keep us playing that are not the game, in my opinion. Now, again, some linguistic person will tell me I'm wrong. That's fine. I'm happy to adjust. But my point is, if I'm right, that meta should be something which is more than just the thing. If the metaverse is about being a way of interacting with people, that doesn't mean that we have to be physically there, but we can be non-physically there. Then I think that we need to think about not just the interaction, not just the space, not just the world, but the transactional elements that happen in that space. And that transaction can be monetary, it can be personal, it can be devising like ways to have common experiences. But if they're tied to a brand, they're tied, a specific brand. So I think you can't have a vertical metaverse in my head. Now, I might be wrong, but my thinking is you can't have a Coca-Cola metaverse. You've got to have a space where Coca-Cola and Pepsi can exist, and we can engage with the brands that we prefer. Now, there might be a Coke space, there might be a Pepsi space, but if I can't make a choice, is that really a metaverse? So that's kind of where I come from.
I would agree with that. I think that the point of a metaverse is that it is. I think possibly more useful to focus on the verse part of there. It is supposed to be kind of like a universe that it is universal. Everything exists within it. So in Gibson's version, the metaverse represented the entirety of the online space. And even like corporations might have tiny little private bubble networks that spun off it, but fundamentally it was the internet, and so any interaction that you did online was through that. Now it's an interesting aspiration to try to create that, because especially as we're moving from flat screens. So in the way that I understand Meta's goals is that they want to create an online space, kind of like PlayStation Home, that people can socialize in, but they can also have meetings in, and they can get work done and so on. And so I believe that they are working on like ways of making all of that stuff work seamlessly in VR. So for the moment, for example, that is pretty much going to require a virtual desktop in VR so that you can check your email or sort of like tab to different apps within the VR experience without having to take the headset off. Because
I'm actually going to chuck in there, because I had some really interesting interview talking about, because obviously with the latest news about Facebook, they've over the last year, I think they've lost 700 billion in their valuation. They've also announced that they are letting go 11,000 people worldwide. That's 13% of the company. And someone, I've forgotten who it was, that commented on the radio. Yes, I still listen to radio. I'm old. But there was an interesting comment about what is Mark Zuckerberg trying to do? And the conversation turned to platform. So I now feel like I totally buy what's going on here. Okay. I don't think Zuckerberg is investing in creating virtual worlds. I think Zuckerberg is trying to define what the next platform looks like. And the next platform is going to have a level of interoperability in a spatial sense. And I think
Okay.
that's a very smart thing to think about. I think the Oculus kind of purchase, the fact that we've got goggles, is a mistake to think about. It is a short-term step towards the ultimate goal, in my opinion.
Okay.
I think we're talking about contact lenses. I think we're talking about glasses. I think we're talking about worlds overlaid on the real world, which is
Right.
I suspect is the way. At the moment, everything's too hard. And if you are Facebook, you do not want to go into another situation where you're relying on Apple or Google for the platform. You're not relying on Microsoft for the platform. And I think that's what Facebook are trying to do. They're trying to create a way of interacting with the world where they can own the platform.
Okay.
And now, what you think about that is a different subject. But I think if you put it in that context, does that make, I think, the Facebook ambitions seem a little bit more, well, a little bit less crazy?
It makes more sense as to how they have spent 15 billion developing it with so little to show. And I think that because for that price, you could have like 20 or 30 God of Wars.
I'd have been happy to build them a metaverse for that.
Yeah, I would. It's an interesting one. I think that the problem that they've got at the moment is that like they may be working on all this clever tech, but they have not figured out a way to showcase it yet, because everything that they've showcased so far, in both looks and content, has basically been very like early stage VR from like
just rubbish.
From like 2014, 2015
I
era
would
VR.
say prior to that, I mean, maybe VR wise, but I think it's kind of like it's sub PlayStation 3 quality.
Except for the legs thing, which was obviously faked with motion capture, and I don't know
Yeah.
why they thought that was a good idea.
Just no, just
Yeah.
just.
I
I mean,
but let's not get into that.
Yeah, but all the stuff we've learned in terms of interactivity in games, I mean, I feel like they just don't have. Well, the fact is that we've been doing this in the game space for so long.
Yes.
And it feels to me that there's a bunch of people, they've probably got some games people, and I don't want to make cast any dispersion against the people they've got. I have no idea what's going on there, but it doesn't feel like they've really understood the player experience.
Yes, I think probably the reason that it looks like that is that the direction from on high is probably, like you said, to focus on platform. So they've probably got all sorts of tools and so on. So when they show these like really naff environments with like the Eiffel Tower in and sort of like very sort of like cartoony avatars and so on, I would assume that the reason that they look like that is because all those environments have all been built using some tool built into the platform rather than built in Maya or Blender and then exported. Because if you can't, I think that's a signature feature of the metaverse. If you want people to work in it, you've got to be able to build the metaverse from within the metaverse. So my guess is that's the reason it all looks a little bit, and why they've had to spend so much trying to make it work, is they are trying to make a space that can be built from within, which is a very
if you're using these things to interact with things, they're not the most. Oh, they're fine. Nothing wrong with these.
They're very good in some respects.
I really like them a lot. I think there's lots of value in. But the bottom line is, are they actually the same level of finesse? And can you concentrate with goggles on your head for that long?
Well, I mean, if you look at some of the VR art tools like Quill or I've forgotten the
Tilt brush or whatever it is.
Tilt brush. Thank you. Stuff like that. I've seen amazing stuff, even though it's relatively limited. Like if you drag a single brushstroke out as a beginner, which is me because I'm not an artist, if you drag a single brushstroke out, you think sort of like, oh, it looks a little bit wobbly, it's a bit hard edged, and so on. But then you look at some stuff that people have made that looks finished, and then you zoom in on it, and it's if you zoom right in, the individual brush strokes do look rough and messy, and so on, but that doesn't matter because the overall image is really good. I think
Yeah.
the problem that Meta have is that they haven't got anybody working on making content within their new platform that is really, really compelling. You need to have something there that people will want to visit. And what they've shown so far is just sort of like empty spaces with a handful of like virtual landmarks scattered around. It doesn't.
It feels to me like that's because the problem they're trying to solve, is a problem for the company. It is not a problem they're trying to solve for the user. And the inherent nature of the devices mean that they are almost contradictory, because the end devices that they are looking to, I suspect they're looking to, are physically impossible currently. The glass level VR is not going to happen for a period of time. Now we're getting a lot closer to it, and it's only going to happen as we see evolving devices, like we've seen, Quest, type devices make a massive step forward in VR, as far as I'm concerned, because of their ability to be portable and convenient.
I must admit, Quest is fantastic as a device. The inside out tracking completely sort of like eliminates the most of the setup phase of VR. It just
works.
The Quest is at the stage where it just works. You put it, as long as you have enough space, as long as you have a big enough room, you pop the Quest on and you can do stuff.
I can be playing Beat Saber faster than I can be playing, say God of War Ragnarok.
Probably it's
a lot faster, hugely faster. It's instantaneous to go. I can just go boom, 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 Beat Saber done.
Yeah.
Whereas I haven't got my copy yet of Ragnarok. I need to go get it. But I've got to install it, download it, get the upgrade. I've got to wait for it to load. It's going to take a 5-minute. I guarantee. I haven't played it yet, but I guarantee there's going to be a 5 minutes sitting there waiting whilst a designer ego trip is played back to me. And no offense to the designers involved. Yes, you've got to do the exposition to get people to understand what's happened in the story so far, but I hate it. It's not me playing. That I know is going to happen in that console experience, and that isn't a good generic user experience. And when you look at Quest, they have actually got a generic, amazing first-time user experience. If you know what you're doing.
I would caveat that with I think anticipation is an important part of the user experience.
That's fair.
And so I think that sort of like just being able to boot it up and immediately be playing is not necessarily as I think making the player wait a little bit before they get to
you can, though. The fact you know that you won't be able to.
It should be something that was by design rather than because you need to download a bunch of stuff.
I'm all for anticipation.
Yeah.
I just this is my problem. I have a problem where people take autonomy away from the player. It annoys me. And the worst one I had, I think, was Watch Dogs 2, where I literally spent 10 minutes pressing X.
Oh, that's
was it Watch Dogs 2? And I think I had a similar thing with Final Fantasy 14 or one of those anyway, where literally, in fact, the whole game for me was just pressing X, and timing didn't even seem to matter. I found I'm going to probably be shouted at for heresy for saying such things, but I find that maybe it's an ADHD thing. I don't know. I'm not diagnosed with one, but I think enough people accuse me of having it.
Okay.
What we haven't talked about. I mean, I'm going to kind of take us on a different direction. So we talked about Metaverse. I've hypothesized that it's actually not about the Quest. The Quest is a stepping stone towards a bigger goal, and I think we've highlighted that there's a clash between the player experience and the purpose for a player versus the corporate experience, the corporate purpose.
Okay.
And I think there's an issue there. I'm going to just highlight something I found. Gartner talking about trends, and we haven't talked about one of the elements of this trend, which has made this a big topic. And they're talking about 4 key factors that make Metaverse a strategic technology. One, Web3. Now, we can argue about whether Web3 is an actual thing or not, but we'll come back to that. But blockchain is part of that conversation. Spatial computing. I think spatial computing is super, super interesting. Then they talk about digital twin of the person.
Okay.
And then they talk about digital twin of the customer being a subset of digital twin of the person. Now, I think those three, four things, however you want to describe them, I think are really interesting ways. And it helps us understand why it's become something which a lot of corporations are starting to find interesting. So, what do you think about that?
I think it's worth probably clarifying what spatial computing means. My understanding is that it's just replicating certain things in a virtual environment for so that it's easier to talk about them. So, for example, if in our field, if you're having a game design meeting, it might be useful to have a little sort of like 3D model of the level that you're discussing floating in front of you, so that you can scroll annotations on it and say sort of like, we want to, there's a choke point here, but everything goes through there. We need a couple of like side routes to allow people to get around the back and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think there's something in that, and something I think we learned from when we were doing PlayStation Home is the use of architectural UX. So the fact of the 3D environment having a profound impact on the way that we interact and the way we expect and where we can foreshadow where interactions happen. It's amazing qualities that happen when you go from a 2D flat plane into a 3D interactive space. Like I can point at something in a virtual world, or actually depends on the system, but in theory I can point something. I can put a post-it note on something, like you said. I can clap, I can have proximate conversation, and that's an amazing thing when you can have proximate. In I walk somewhere and you can hear me if you're near me, but you can't hear me when you're not near me. That's really fascinating from a interactive point of view.
I think it is. I can see that being really good. So I can imagine I can imagine that working for a level design meeting. What you're saying about like the environmental cues.
Yeah.
If you've got like your design team gathered around a like floating model of the level, I think it does make maybe a difference whether you at your company that meeting appears to take place in some sort of amazing sort of like corner office looking out over a city and everything's clean and beautiful, or whether it appears to take place in a like a garage full of sort of like half dismantled engines and stuff like that. Either of which might be like thematically quite appropriate for
exactly
sort of like for game design, but you could argue that level of customization of the environment could feed into corporate culture to a certain extent. Do we see ourselves as sort of like kind of like executives crafting something like from the top of a tower block, or do we see ourselves as getting down and dirty in the nuts and bolts of making something that works?
But it's a psychological kind of dimension, which adds something very profound that you can't do. I mean, if you think about the kinds of offices which have these kind of green field areas, or they literally inside the office they have like fake grass in the room, and they have like picnic kind of tables. There's reasons why they do that. They have they'll have a health skills kind of like slide going down the center of the building. Why? Because they're trying to create a culture. Now, the thing is that virtual space for me can also, because that can be adapted so quickly and so relatively cheaply, that can allow us to kind of cue the creative and the kind of purpose of the context of the meeting.
Oh yeah. So you could well, as a clumsy example, you could theme your meeting rooms around the game that you're working on. For a start,
but also you might say, I'm going to have a room full of William Gibson inspired motifs, images that kind of allow me to imagine what Wintermeal looks like. That kind of principle, having essentially an AI facilitator in the room that is Wintermeal, that'd be awesome. But the point of that is that you've got to find this balancing act, I think, between therefore fun and the psychological staging that it does about how it frames what you're doing. And I think this to me is an example of the fact that what we've done there. One, we've got a remote space. It means that anybody can be anywhere and still be in the same space. Two, we have a visualization process where we can actually have our world, our level, and we can step into that world, that level, instantaneously, potentially. I mean, obviously, depending on how the space is done, the system you're using, and we can literally go up and experience as a player would as we're doing the design. Now, if that's done in a consistent way, you can imagine grey boxing out a level and playing with it and then raising it. I've still some amazing stuff done by the Unity VR team where they were literally in world using the controllers to change the map. Love it. Oh, here's a tank. Let's make that tank bigger. Amazing. Now, if I can do that and step in and step out in terms of dimension, the kind of view of it, this for games particularly, but I think for other industries.
I mean, I can see applications of that. Just like I googled spatial computing, for example, and there's a picture of a virtual car, so with people standing around it. Presumably, they're sort of like working on like the aerodynamics or how to pack all of the necessary machinery inside the space. I don't know how cars are made, clearly, but I can see it working for those sorts of very spatial tasks. Does it work if you are just sort of having a 10-minute scrum and everybody is just telling you what they've updated, and maybe you just need to plan a sprint, and you just have a Kanban board with a whole bunch of prioritized tasks, and you just need to move them in from one column to another?
Well, let's use that example. Right, so we have a Kanban space. The Kanban space is themed, whatever the context and direction and imperative of the project is right now. I walk up to the post-it note and move it. I point at a post-it note. I tap on a post-it note, and then a visualization of the thing that I'm currently working on appears. I could go over and walk at the PowerPoint presentation. I could look at the wiki, and then you can see what I'm looking at.
That's true.
Oh my god! Have I actually kind of made you think there might be something in this?
I don't know that. I don't know that is significantly easier than doing it on a flat screen, because you can still summon all of that information on a flat screen. I think the difficulty is that, like, what exactly is the benefit of having this metaverse that combines all meetings and all tools and all websites and all experiences into one contiguous space?
Yes. And that's the irony, is although I said earlier, I don't think you can have a Coke space or a Pepsi space. You have to have a space where Pepsi and Coke can exist. I actually don't think there'll be one metaverse. I think there'll be many. But the interoperability is the kind of key here. I think your point here is that unless there's actually a compelling advantage, it won't get used.
Yeah, that's my big word. My biggest complaint, to be honest, is that we actually have a lot of advantages with the World Wide Web as it stands at the moment over a 3D environment such as PlayStation Home. So with the World Wide Web, if you're searching for something, you type in what you're searching for and you get your search results. Those search results are that is essentially like a filtered list of all the things that are nearest to what you were looking for conceptually. In a 3D world, it doesn't really make.
Let me give you an actual example. Alexa, what is the metaverse?
In futurism and science fiction, the metaverse is a hypothetical iteration of the internet as a single, universal and immersive virtual
Alexa,
world.
stop. I don't know if you guys heard that, but I basically literally just did what I would do in the metaverse by asking a voice operated search piece to tell me what something is, and I got an instant answer, which was actually very much like Chris's definition of the metaverse.
However, basically what you got was a description. What you need then is like a list of do you now want to go to sort of like look at
what you mean having a visual format that might be pull up a list of options?
What I'm saying is basically you're going to have if there's a whole bunch of different things that Alexa or your voice assistant has found for you, they're going to have to be like assembled into a 2D list basically, and one of them might be like looking up stuff about Gibson's book Neuromancer. One of them might be going and looking at like Meta's quarterly results or something like that.
But you're just describing a visualization question.
My point is that what is the benefit of trying to position those things in a 3D space? They are not fundamentally spatial.
Good question. That is an interesting point. However, there could be spatial qualities to them. There could be elements of what you might do with them that could be spatial. I don't know what they are at the moment. I'm trying to think in terms of the, for example, if something has been visualized as a 3D experience. So if, it gives you a list of different themed metaverse world spaces, you could say, I'm going to go there. And then you transition into that virtualized space. So you get to actually experience it. I might be talking about dinosaurs. Okay, so if I search happens to be a dinosaurs and there are a bunch of 3D models out there, I could actually pull those 3D models into the space and see them immediately, and experience them in a way that I wouldn't otherwise be able to.
Yeah, I mean there are benefits to that. I mean, even something as dry as Meta's quarterly results, you can imagine having a graph and just being able to sort of like just like zoom out. Let's see this quarter in a larger context.
Exactly.
That would be easy.
This is something I genuinely think is really interesting. In fact, we've got a legacy corporate client we're working with, and we're looking at what Metaverse can do for them. And one of those things we're considering is things like, how do you do a report? And it'd be interesting to see whether you can have board meetings in that space. So because these are large organizations that maybe cross the globe, if they can be in a space and they can present data, think what you can do with Tableau, or Power BI, one of those kind of data tools. Now add the ability to be able to visualize that in a 3D space. What different data could you present if you can have more than 2 dimensions essentially on the graph displayed in a way that actually feels useful? If you can pull a section of the data to see how that then explodes out more information. I think that as a presentation tool in that space could actually allow us to get much more detail, much more interesting space. But the thing I'm not hiding and not talking about is the work to get that set up. At the moment, we don't have the tools.
I was just going to say, when you think about how much work it is to set up a website, which is basically just like a document, a 2D document with some text and pictures. Setting up a website is a significant barrier. Not everyone can do it.
Completely.
So what happens is, say we had a metaverse, what happens when you want to go and check like the local pizza place and see if it's still open or not? I imagine that the platform would provide an easy way to provide the basic information. But we're probably talking basic information. You will have I guess that pizza place's representation in the metaverse is going to boil down to maybe kind of like a logo, if you're lucky, some photographs perhaps, and a little bit of textual data about its physical position and opening hours.
Well, actually, go more than that. So I was watching this YouTube video the other day talking about a weird device they found in a university. Turned out that device was simply about counting how many Bluetooth signals, how many Wi-Fi signals were in that space. Why? Because if they counted how many Wi-Fi signals there, they could see how busy that room was. So imagine having a kind of very simple, non-invasive monitor system that just tracks how many people have their phones in that space. Now, if you then use that data, if you use the Internet of Things in smart ways, then non-invasive, not privacy-affecting data points can be applied automatically in the space. So I create my pizza place. I have the telemetry data for the rate of which pizzas are going out the door. I have a telemetry rate of people who are actually turning up physically. I have a spectrum showing me the proportion of different ingredients and the stock that the pizza factory, the pizza shop has, the opening times, a whole bunch of raw data could be plugged in. Now,
well, I would argue that we already have that, because if you look at Google Maps, it will tell you how like when the busy times are for a particular shop, if you Google it, because and I think that is presumably based on the time of day that people search for it. So if people are looking for pizza, they're doing it in the evening mostly, and that Google assume that people search for pizza when they want pizza and not for later on.
True. I mean, but the thing is though that there is a delay between the searching for pizza and the searching for a particular pizza place, and which pizza place you pick and which pizza place is actually serving, and the rate at which that serving is going out. There's a whole bunch of stuff which we don't currently track, and I don't want to use the word track to scare people. I mean, I just mean it's information that would be useful and interesting. And all I was using is this as an example to show this is stuff that could be visualized in really interesting ways. We still haven't come to the point about this becomes interesting, I think, only when it is easier than using a flat screen.
Exactly. Yeah.
When does that happen?
That's my point. So so what does it take to make? Because the idea is that the metaverse, everything will be in the metaverse, so you will not need to leave the metaverse, except for sort of like physically to sleep and use the bathroom and stuff like that. So
this is why I disagree with the principle that it has to be VR. I think the red herring is the VR bit.
Okay.
I think the metaverse should be accessible via 2D screen. I think the metaverse should be accessible via glasses. I think the metaverse should be accessible with other mechanisms.
That's an interesting thing. There is no reason why you shouldn't be able to access the metaverse on a flat screen.
You won't be able to do as much.
Yeah. In the same way that like there are VR chat rooms that support flat screen users, and they are represented slightly differently so that you can tell the difference because they're using a flat screen. So for the big thing with VR chat rooms is that by virtue of tracking the user's head and hands for interaction purposes, you can also use them for expressive purposes. So you can gesture with your hands and you can nod and shake your head at people, and you can see where someone is looking.
Next thing, we're going to have cameras on phones. Oh wait. You mean we could actually do a lot of that capture of the facial recognition because we've got a front-facing camera? There's a lot we can already do with that interactivity. I mean, we're not doing. There are issues around it. Don't get me wrong.
I mean, that's a slightly different thing. I mean, if I go onto a video a VR chat room with my webcam active, then that could read my facial expression probably easier than somebody who's wearing a headset. But that's a different
But you could also see my movement of my head. I mean, if you're using a phone, you see the movement of the phone. All I'm saying is, there's a bunch more interactivity that we're currently not tapping into for technical reasons. There are reasons why it's not easy to do. There are reasons why it's clumsy. There is not necessarily enough motivation to make that work, arguably.
I mean, it's an interesting one. I mean, I know that you consider the VR to be a bit of a distraction. One of the key issues, I think, with VR is the comfort factor. It is not comfortable to use VR for extended periods. When I'm working on a VR game, I do not want to have that headset on all bloody day. I put it on to test something, and then I take it off again so that I can actually work. Now, if in some cases, I will grant you, this is maybe something that is so specific to a VR developer. Sometimes I want to have the headset on because I'm testing something, and also be able to sort of like pause the profiler so that I can like see what is like causing these spikes in frame rate. To give an example, and that as a VR developer, I spend a lot of time balancing the headset on my head so that I can see on the flat screen what the headset is looking at, and I can also click on the profiler and say, show me that spike. If I could bring the profiler into the 3D view, so I could have it parented to my head, and I could just like touch on it in 3D, that would actually be easier.
You mean XR? You mean we actually need XR? As in, wherever you define it. But for me, pass-through VR, AR combined with VR, as a single experience is actually really interesting.
But I don't know, can we think of an example, a more real-world example of somebody needing to do that, where they have the VR headset on and they want to, I guess, I know, you're playing Beat Saber and your phone rings and like you get a notification within VR that to show who it is, and you can potentially just sort of like answer it from within VR and like talk to somebody
whilst you're the point, isn't it?
While you're playing Beat Saber.
We're blurring boundaries. That's the whole point.
I mean, I can see that being. I could see that being useful.
But that's the point we're trying to get to, is what we're actually after. At the end of the day, what a metaverse should be is the ability to be able to blur my digital and physical life. I think if we can focus on that as a user experience, where we can augment our digital life and physical life, I think that could be super, super interesting. I think the fact that I have to go to a device and change my perspective or change my frame of reference because of the device, even pulling my phone out does that. But the reason why the phone is so powerful for me is that I can do that so conveniently, so instantly.
Well, I mean, okay, so if we do agree that there is a kind of utopian version of this where all of our devices and software are interoperable to some extent, so we could. I
appreciate the difficulty of the utopian part, but you know, we've pretty well with
it feels like there is a lot of work to get there.
Yeah,
but maybe that's the work that Meta are doing, hence the expense. So
maybe.
what I'm just wondering, given that we've established that they're losing, they're having to cut back. They've had to shed 11,000 staff. They have overreached a bit, flush with lockdown money. Their share price is also crashing. I think it's fair to say that not many people outside Meta really understand what they are trying to accomplish. I mean, I would include ourselves there. We're hypothesizing that maybe they're building this platform that is amazing and therefore justifies all that money. But most people will not have a clue what that is. What will they need to do to sell this?
Yeah. And I think it comes back to, remember what we said at the beginning. I don't think you can have a Coca-Cola metaverse. I don't think you can have a Facebook metaverse. I think that it's something that requires collaboration. I think it's something that requires interoperability. And if there's anything that's going to kill the metaverse, it's the fact that brands will not want to give up their ownership of the customer. And actually, it takes the understanding that you need an environment like the real world is an environment where you can't dominate it yourself as one brand and entity, that allows that opportunity to be able to compare, contrast, engage. And I think if anything is going to kill the progression of the metaverse, it's the fact that people are trying to own it. The reason why for me the internet works so well is because we didn't try to own it. It was for everybody. And I think that we are in a difficult commercial space right now where the understanding that it needs to be a common space, that it needs to be a shared space, is creating all sorts of reasons why we're going to get bad experiences rather than good experiences. That's my opinion at the moment.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I'm a massive fan of the metaverse. I think that subsets of the metaverse are going to be amazing and really, help with training, interaction, allow us to connect with people across the world in ways that are much more human than just a simple kind of Zoom call. I think there's so much power there to be had, but we run a risk of losing track of there's a difference between what we need as an organization and what we need as a user. And there's one thing that I was always taught, which is identify and satisfy consumer needs.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that matters.
Yeah. And I must admit, I am skeptical of the metaverse as a project generally, but I can see the benefit, especially as I run a remote company. I can see the benefit of having meetings in VR where you can create a space for your team that your team has customized themselves, and so you can choose the sort of environment that you want to work in. And I can see it being nice to gather the team in that.
And AI tools that respond to the actions you're trying to do, in the same way we're seeing digital art being created out of massive repositories of sources, creating some really interesting, weird but interesting principles. I think we are heading towards some really interesting spaces.
I'm old enough to remember Clippy, so AI assistance just triggers me.
I get that, but look at what they're doing in terms of if AI is used to help facilitate our ability to do visualization, for example. If we're in charge and the tool is to make our job easier, that's a different thing.
Yeah. I guess what people want is the Iron Man's Jarvis, where he says, what's the scene? He's working on the virtual suit, and he says cover the surface in gold to stop it from freezing. Oh, that looks a bit showy. Throw some hot rod red in there.
That's exactly
it. And the AI basically goes, okay, I will pick random panels to make red, and it looks super cool because AI is that good.
But that is the point, though. Is it's about using AI to facilitate the hard, the detail bits, not the thinking process, not the decision making.
I mean, obviously that's Hollywoodized, but I can imagine that you could go in there and say okay, a bit like the way that AI art happens at the moment. You give it a prompt and say take this existing model and color the panels in a combination of these two colors in a pleasing arrangement
by
and
whatever.
And that I think is kind of a justifiable use of AI, but we're getting into like
So
AI
let's
ethics.
wrap up because we're running out of time.
Yeah.
But what I think, what I'm hoping I've done is at least say, look, if we think differently about the metaverse, if we look at the metaverse as a project that's not about what the tech we currently have or the tech that we could have, if we think about the metaverse as essentially there is a fight going on for the next platform, and they haven't even worked out what the next platform is, in my opinion.
Yeah.
The problem we have right now is that we can't put ourselves in the consumer experience yet, because that experience is defined by the physical limitations of the devices we currently have.
Yeah.
But there is something in being able to blur the boundaries between our digital and physical lives in a way that actually works with us, not against us. At the moment, a lot of the experiences we're seeing are attempts to show what's possible rather than attempts to make our lives easier. And I think that's the fundamental breakage right now, even down to blockchain. We didn't get a chance to go into that. To me, blockchain's value in this context is purely about facilitating transactions that don't rely on a single database, that allow that multi-experience to be interoperable. And there's so much of a dark hole rabbit hole we could go down if we went
There
into
absolutely
that.
is, but I don't think it's fundamental to the concept of the metaverse.
Exactly,
I think the metaverse will work just fine without blockchain,
as long as there is a mechanism to handle the transactional part of it.
Yeah.
And that's all that I think we need. So do you have any last minute thoughts you want to wrap up with?
Not really. I'm still skeptical of the overall project of trying to make something that people will want to do everything in, because I think that people quite like to context switch in the way that people like to shut off their PC and go and sit with the family in front of the TV. That's a nice thing.
Context switching is really interesting.
And I think that sort of like just switching the focus inside your VR goggles to the virtual cinema room where like your family have already logged on and they were waiting for you to start the movie, it's not quite the same.
No. But I think you've hit your nail on something. Again, that sounds like you're describing issues to do with human relationships. And I think a lot of the stuff that we're doing forgets that it's supposed to be about human relationships.
Yeah. Okay, here's a good example. What would be kind of cool is if I could, I'm just remembering an example when I was out at the GDC, if I could have like put a VR headset on and then sat next to my daughter and read her a bedtime story from halfway around the world, that would have been pretty damn cool.
No, completely. I completely get that, and I think at the end of the day, the reason why we're struggling with the metaverse is twofold. One is the technology. The other one is why. Because we can make a virtual world doesn't mean we should. What we should be making is things that make our lives better and enriching. The way the commercial structures work at the moment, I would argue, is actually contrary to that. If you want an environment where you can sell more T-shirts, more Coca-Cola, whatever else it might be, I think you need to put people first. You need to put the experience of individuals first, but also it's how they interact with other people. How does that virtual world reduce the friction in my life? If I can actually engage and it reduces my friction, and guess what? Every new innovation that has really rocketed has done something which has reduced the friction in people's lives.
I can agree with that.
That to me is that. Hopefully, I've given you some kind of thoughts to feel better about the metaverse. Hopefully, I've painted you a picture that makes you feel excited about the possibilities. But that takes us to the end of our podcast. So, Chris, thank you very much. Is there anywhere that people should get hold of you?
You can currently find me on Twitter at Quixotl, Quixotl. And there's also a link to my Mastodon there, since Twitter seems to be currently on fire.
Yes, Mastodon is something I haven't looked into yet. I need to think about that because, like you say, Twitter's currently on fire. The Bond villain has taken over the communication platform. We shall see how that all transpires. I'm obviously I say obviously I am Athanasius, Athanateus. Yes, if you want to know, that's an old role-playing game character I've had since QuakeNet as my user to handle. Yes, I am that old. I have been your host. This has been your Game Dev London podcast. Please like, subscribe, and encourage other people if you've enjoyed this. If you didn't, come and tell us so we can make it better. And obviously, be delighted to be back and talking about all those issues, any issue we can find that affects the making of games. Thank you very much for listening, and take care and see you soon.